Hey everyone, welcome to the Apex One Learn About Upgrading webinar. My name is Mikkel Clifford. I'm a support engineer here at Trend Micro. After this webinar, we'll have the video recording available. There's also a Q&A widget you'll notice on the right side so we can answer any questions you have throughout the webinar. And there's also an information and resources widget so you can download any of the materials. So let's go ahead and get started today. We're basically talking about Apex One and Apex Central from a support perspective. So it's going to be relatively similar if you've seen our videos on the support stream. So some new stuff entered in on the slides, but overall it's just about new feature supportability and administrative functions of these particular items. So the first thing I want to go over is that Apex Central policy deployment is required for our new integrated services such as application control, endpoint sensor, and vulnerability protection. Given that it's integrated now, the plugin manager doesn't have the same capabilities it used to manage standalone application control or standalone VP and deploy it. So it's important to note if you're going to be using these products that you're going to have to integrate your Apex One and your Apex Central together in order to deploy these policies. Continuing on, the Apex Central policy deployment is much easier than it used to be through the widget if you did have the standalone product. Essentially, once you set up the policy, all you do is enable and then send it out to the endpoint or endpoints, and everything will go through. The integrated products, if you have their standalone counterparts, such as standalone application control, it'll uninstall that specifically. So like if you deploy IAC, your standalone IAC goes away. So there's some important considerations to undergo when doing things like that. We'll get to that in just a second. So integrated vulnerability protection. This is kind of what I was leading into. It's a very lightweight NDIS filter driver that's deployed to help you protect your machine from different vulnerabilities in the environment. It also offers virtual patching. So let's say you have a program or a Microsoft update, for example, maybe WannaCry, Eternal Blue, something like that. Vulnerability protection can virtually patch it before, let's say, Microsoft releases a patch. So you're protected from that until you can push that patch to your environment or they come out with an official patch to protect you. So it's very timely. The IPS rules are now managed by Trend Micro. You don't generally add your own IPS rules anymore. And this is done through our global research team. They find what vulnerabilities are out there in the wild and protect against those specifically. The recommendation scan has been deprecated from the standalone version. And this brings up some questions when you're deploying. If you do have standalone vulnerability protection with a lot of bypass rules and a lot of custom objects in it, you may want to stay with that. If you don't have it at all, then the integrated solution is good, or if you don't utilize bypass rules, the integrated protection is good. So in the security versus performance mode, there's a slightly higher impact when you're in the security mode because there's more rules activated, but it's just a slight network impact. I haven't really noticed any in my lab, but it's there in our documentation, so I thought I'd mention it. So searching and setting the IPS rules is very simple. When you're looking at them, you can do a search, and this could be partial string searches. So if you're looking for different SMB exploits like shown on the screenshot here, you can just search that, search the identifier, whatever, and it'll come up. And if you notice, a certain identifier hitting in your environment for maybe a custom program you guys have, you can just disable it so, we're not blocking it or detecting it. However, just know that there's no bypass rule, so you can't just allow it for one particular endpoint or to bypass that rule. It's going to be for the entire rule altogether. So currently under the security priority, there's about 210 IPS rules, and this will increase over time. And it's the same with the performance priority. There's 130, but it will increase over time. So if you want to look at the rules and what their actual exploit is, as well as a good description, links to the exploit itself, you just go to your policies, policy resources, and your intrusion prevention rules, and that's the listing of it. So when you're looking it up here, you can find out exactly what the vulnerability is, how high it is, maybe the common vulnerability security score on it, the CVSS, and assess what the vulnerability protection is protecting you against. So integrated application control is another one of our integrated products coming with Apex One. and it generally blocks application installation and execution based upon criteria set forth by the administrator. So there's a lockdown policy, and this is very common in environments. Once you issue the lockdown policy to an agent, it begins scanning the inventory of that agent, takes all the files, puts it in a hash, and then adds it to a database. Anything at that point in time that isn't on the computer that runs will flag on it, right? So essentially, you have to configure your block and allow rules for any new software coming into the environment that you want to allow. This turns into an exercise of, different cross-sectionals of endpoints versus users. So you have certain users on certain endpoints that you want to apply applications that they can run, let's say Visual Studio. You could do it across endpoints, and then maybe your group of developers need access to that, and then you can issue an allow on that so it blocks everyone else. If you find a global program that you want to issue to everybody all at one time without editing each individual policy, then the Trusted Programs list will allow you to bypass all of it and allow every user to run it in that policy, of course. So the best practice for integrated application control, if you're issuing it initially, maybe you've never used it before, maybe you just want to see what's going on. So you set out the lockdown and leave it in assess mode. We have a couple of widgets. I don't have a screenshot here, but there's two widgets for application control, and they show when an application runs outside of that lockdown. So once you put in assess mode, you can see exactly what a user is trying to run, or users are trying to run, and maybe you want to whitelist that in your environment or add it to the Trusted Program list because every user is trying to use it. But generally, you just want to leave it in assess mode for a period of time where you can evaluate exactly what is going down before you send out a block and get some complaints from HR about Minesweeper not being allowed through. So integrated endpoint sensor, this is the biggie. This is what everyone's after and everyone has questions about. It's the core component of EDR functionality. It is a separate license. I do have to mention that. If you have any problems deploying any of the integrated products, just reach out to your sales guy, or sales gal, and they'll get you squared away with whatever licensing you need to get these products. But if you plan on using EDR functionality, you must have endpoint sensor. It's just like all the other integrated components where you just click, enable, and it goes. But endpoint sensor has some checkboxes in there which are important to evaluate. So event recording, if you want to supply information from the endpoint to the server, that has to be enabled. And then that's just the recording part of it. The log data, if you don't have that checked, it will not send the metadata to the control or the Apex Central, and you won't be able to conduct investigations. So those two have to be checked. If at any point you want to turn those off, it'll keep the historical data, and you can still do searches on the Apex Central through EDR on the historical data there, but any future events will not go through. So the attack discovery engine, it identifies the possible advanced persistent threats and analyzes suspicious behavior. So it's a little resource intensive. It's where that resource intensiveness comes from on the EDR or the endpoint sensor. So you may want to disable that for whatever reason, but in order to conduct a proper investigation, you will need to have that enabled. So once you get the endpoint sensor on and you're issuing a policy, there's Apex One server policy inside of Apex Central. And this just has a couple of options, and this is particularly important. So there's a metadata storage option, right? The maximum amount. This assigns the amount the SQL Server uses or will use for that metadata cache. Once you get past that point, let's say you set it for 450 gigabytes, if it ever gets past that on the SQL Server, it'll overwrite the older data until it fills up. The maximum memory allocation is for performance, really, on the investigations. So depending on how many agents you have in your environment, you'll either need to increase or decrease this to allow for, your server resources versus the performance you need out of it. If you ever have too little resources available on that memory allocation, then it will give you a banner saying, investigations will be slow because you don't have the minimum amount of memory allocation for the investigation. I have some values up here on the recommended, so make sure to take note of those. And again, these resources will be available in the video in totality at the end of the slideshow. So if you ever want that information, it'll be handy for you. EDR. All right. So I just want to give a simple example of how to do an assessment and what it looks like. So essentially, you specify a criteria to assess impact, and you could do this several different ways. In particular, we're talking about just a custom criteria, and you can see on the right, maybe, if you increase the size. It's a little blurry on my screen. But let's just say you put an IP address in there. Endpoint sensor will sweep that criteria, that IP, that host name, and any endpoints impacted by that criteria will show up in the list. And you just simply select it and generate a root cause analysis, and then you can evaluate the chain of events that led to that impact. This is what it would look like if you did an example. This is just based on our web reputation, sort of like an ICAR for a web reputation. And you can see it just gives you a chain of what happened to cause that specific criteria to happen. I do have to give a shout out about the API. I love API. So we have a lot of API functionality now within Apex Central. And essentially it just allows any program to access internal parts of Apex Central. So you can issue different commands to it without having to go through the console, and allows you to automate away. So the API, once you register it through the Apex Central, you get an application ID, an API key, and then you have to generate a JSON web token. Once those three things are done, you can start issuing commands to the Apex Central to either get agents or even do threat intelligence on it. So like the API covers three particular aspects of it, Apex Central commands such as isolate, move, uninstall the agent. You can do all those things through just a simple command. Custom intelligence like adding UDSOs, uploading sticks or IOC files, and then threat investigation, conducting preliminary investigations, getting a task ID and returning it. So essentially you can automate a lot of the tedious work of administrating away and just focus on the high-level decisions you need to make about that, or even program those high-level decisions right into the logic. The Edge Relay has undergone a lot of enhancements. So the Edge Relay sits in the DMZ, and it allows external agents to communicate with your on-prem Apex One server. And this is very important in the functionality they've added, because now, before you could only do logs, right? Logs and sample submissions. Now you can issue policy and update the agent hotfix level. So also multiple Apex One servers can talk to one Edge Relay, and this essentially gives you a SaaS-like type of environment where your external agents won't lose connectivity to your Apex One, and you won't lose manageability of that agent once it's off-premise. All right, now into the Apex One server considerations. Love this part. So we've already had a question today, and I think this might answer that. In-place upgrade or a migration? This is a decision everyone has to make. Do I want to reuse the same server I'm on and just upgrade it, or move on to a new platform? Our recommended path is migration. I would recommend that all day, every day. If you have the resources available, it is the easiest way to go. You can control your upgrade. It'll allow you to test in your environment with the new agent, the new integrated components without affecting production. Unsupported legacies won't be impacted because you won't move them there, and they're not already there. And the only cons I could actually think of for doing in place versus migration is that the resources for the new server to stand up, obviously, and then you just have to migrate the agents over, which is just slightly more work because the in place are already there. So all you have to do is allow them to update. So if you are going to do an in-place upgrade, these are the couple of pros and the many cons that go along with that. So the pros are you only have to increase it to the Apex One standard resources, which is slightly higher than XGSP1. So you don't need a new server. And you don't need to migrate any agents, with the caveat that any unsupported OSs, you'll have to move off to a different server. XP is no longer supported on Apex One, 2008 non-R2, and pretty much anything below that. So the cons of doing it are the operating systems, of course, the legacy operating systems. And you have to do a lot of preamble before you do the in-place upgrade. Make sure to take a snapshot, backup of the database, backup all the files you need just in case. Because if something goes wrong, you just affected your production heavily. Another big change on the Apex One, the TLS and digital signature, they are not disableable. I think that's a word, maybe. TLS 1.2 is mandatory. Anyone who has had a ticket with us before where they changed the ASE value to equal 0 to bypass this, essentially changing the communication from HTTPS to HTTP, will need to revert that change before doing an in-place upgrade. It's a huge, huge thing. So, and then you also have to prep your environment. Windows 7 and 2008 R2 didn't come with this as a default secure protocol. So you may have to run the Easy Fix from Microsoft, which does enable those communication protocols to be default. Microsoft right now, I think, is pushing updates because they're deprecating TLS1 as well. So there should be soon, if there's not already, Microsoft patch to enable TLS 1.2. Digital signature checking, like I said, not disableable anymore. All server-side components, when you're updating the agent, will do a digital signature validation. And if it fails this, it won't update. This is the cause of a lot of my agents aren't updating issues. The certificates are part of the certificate revocation list, and generally that's updated by Windows updates. But if you control those or you don't issue them very often, some certificates may expire and then it can't do the validation. A little touch on network topology and infrastructure. There is bidirectional communication from the agent internally. So the default ports are HTTPS 4343 and HTTP 8080. The agent reaches to the server on these ports, and then you define an agent listening port upon install, or if you're migrating from a different server and you match up that listening port, it'll be defined by that. If you do a server migration tool, it does import that value over. So just make sure to note that if you do change it and then you do a server migration, it'll change it to whatever you migrated from. So those are the two major communications between the server and the agent. So utilizing update agents is a great way to reduce bandwidth and stress on your server. This allows you to pinpoint different agents in your environment so you can segregate out traffic. Like if you have an MPLS going across and you don't want 200 agents from your remote office reaching your office scan server over that MPLS, you just put an update agent at that office, and then that one agent would connect to the server, and then all of the office would connect to that update agent to get their updates and their policies. There's a full list we have, and I think it's in the resources on the right-hand side, of all of the URLs required for the Apex One agent to work at its fullest extent. This includes public IP addresses for like our census server, giving prevalence statistics and things like that to our different modules. So make sure to review that and open up and whitelist any ports or URLs you need. This is a really general amount of data. So if you have an agent that's not really doing much of anything, you're not uploading a lot of logs, there's not a lot of detections, then we calculate it out to be about 3 megabytes up a day and about 9 megabytes down per day. So just multiply this by how many agents you have, and you'll get the rough estimate of how much bandwidth you'll be utilizing just for an agent existing within the environment. If you have a huge amount of DLP rules, for example, or you have a lot of random, maybe you're testing malware in your environment, I don't know why, but maybe you are, and you have a lot of detections, the log uploads will significantly increase that amount. They're not huge, but if you get a lot of them, it can add up, especially per agent. One of the biggest things I've noticed is proxied environments, especially with SSL inspection and TTL transformation. The certificates are checked against the server, so if that certificate is altered or the TTL becomes too long, the agent will consider it somewhat of a man-in-the-middle attack, and it'll drop it. So you'll lack the ability, you'll see offline agents, you'll not be able to update. Like various things can happen when you do this. So it's imperative to whitelist the URLs and bypass that SSL inspection if you can. All right, this is the big one. This is what everyone wants to know. I think we just published a KB on this actually, so good stuff right here. System requirements and sizing guide. I'm going to kind of breeze over the base because, I mean, this is just for the systems to exist in the environment. And it's relatively minimal whenever you have less than, we'll say, 1,000 agents. This will be fairly true for about that amount. But it's going to scale. It's going to scale as you get more and more agents inside of your environment. So OS support, this is true of both Apex Central and Apex One. We'll go over Apex Central in a second. But 2012 and up now, and if you were to call me, I would say 2016 or 2019 because new technology is great, old technology is not as great. So just future-proof yourself and get the new servers. Processor requirements, base 4-core. That's at about 1.86 gigahertz if you need to know that part. Amount of agents, again, scale that factor, scale all factors, really. The memory, 3 gigabytes without endpoint sensor and 8 gigabytes with. And this is because of that memory allocation that you need to set aside for the processing of investigations. Disk space requirements, relatively conservative there. 7 gigabytes without endpoint sensor and 8 gigabytes with. And then the SQL Server, this has been a point of matrix, really. But I tried to simplify it here. So if you're using SQL Express R2 SP2 or later, 2008, if you're using a standalone or standard or enterprise going forward, 2008 or later, and then 2016 SP1 or later for endpoint sensor. The reason for that is the full text search and semantic search feature. It has to be there. So I know some people might have ran into an issue where the core licensing model wasn't working, but that it has been repaired, and we're releasing a new patch for it, or actually a repack of the EXE. So anything 2016 SP1 or later with that enabled will work great. All right, Apex Central base system requirements. Again, very, very conservative, and Apex Central is a product that remains fairly static with its system requirements, so it makes it really simple. So like I said, OS support, same thing. Go 2016 or 2019. Be a cool person and do that. Processor requirements, 4 cores. Memory requirements, 8 gigs. Disk space has a wide range there, but it's just for the amount of space that maybe logging will consume and things like that. So 80 gigabytes is recommended. SQL Server falls in the same category. R2 SP2 or later for Express, for standalone 2008 or later, and then I would recommend 2016 SP1 or later. And that's just because if you ever want to go to EDR, you ever want to use it, endpoint sensor, you're going to need it. So if you have the ability to do so, then just going straight there would be excellent and allow you for future growth. All right, here's the endpoint count sizing. This is without endpoint sensor. So as you can see on this chart, 3,000, 8 cores, 8 gigs, and that's with Express installed on the machine. You can do a standalone, that's fine. But if you were to have all this on one machine, you have less than 3,000, that's essentially what you'll go for, 8 cores and 8 gigs. Once you start going above, you're going to need to separate out to a separate SQL instance to separate the processing. And you're looking at, for 10,000 agents, 12 cores and 32 gigs. And then 25,000, you're looking at 40 cores and 128 gigs. Now, if you're going to go above 25,000, we would recommend multiple Apex One servers to distribute the load. If you do decide to keep going on that path, where you just want to feed it more and more and more, you can. But for various reasons, I don't think you'd want to do that per se. And there's another caveat to that too, which is the IIS and the amount of communications going on. So maybe you don't want to load balance out the connections. 25,000 is a good amount, so you don't saturate your environment and start dropping some communications due to 503 errors, for example. The good news is, with Apex Central the way it is, going above 25,000 and just spacing out another Apex One server, you just register them all to the same Apex Central, and since we're moving toward a policy deployment through Apex Central, it reduces your overall administration effort over multiple machines. So the Apex One sizing with endpoint sensor changes it just a little bit. You can see here the endpoint count for 3,000 has risen to 12 cores and 32 gigs of RAM. And you're going to need to really monitor the metadata storage and the maximum memory allocation we discussed previously. So we'll get into the metadata storage in, I think actually we already did that one, but we can review it later as well. As you start getting up, you're definitely going to have to move to a SQL standalone. You're not going to be able to handle the amount of processing going on just through a SQL on the same server as that. So at 3,000, you're going to need 20 gigabytes allocated for the endpoint sensor and investigations. And that max metadata storage that you see there, that's the per month minimum amount for 3,000 agents. Once you get to 10,000, you're going to start breaching an area where endpoint sensor and investigations are going to be taking such a high toll that you're just going to want to split it out. So just make sure to do that. Apex Central general sizing is a little bit easier. 8 cores, 8 gigs. I mean, it's just going to remain fairly stagnant. The only thing that really takes a hit is the SQL Server spec, and you're going to need to just increase the computing power because of all the log handling. And Apex Central reaches out to the SQL Server to do most of that. So if you're going to have the Express on the same machine, then you're going to need to raise that RAM to 12 gigs. However, if you're going to do a standalone, then you could just do 8.8 all the way through. So if you need to go beyond 50,000, then just give us a call. We'll help you size out exactly what you need there. So, I mean, pretty much any amount of agents we can handle. Server migration.
Today we're talking about the server migration, specifically the server migration tool, so we can move our settings from our OfficeScan server to our Apex One server. So it's important to note that the server migration consideration videos we made previously will lead into this, and they have consequences of client port that need to be evaluated before you even move to the install video. So just make a mental note of that and review that at your leisure. So the importance of moving the settings from your OfficeScan server is there's some settings that the Apex Central policy does not cover, and these settings are fairly crucial, such as firewall policies and profiles, the domain structure themselves, and it does bring this stuff over. Although we'll be using policies to target these domains once they're created, it's going to be important for the domains to be there when you migrate the agents and to have settings, so if someone accidentally clicks save, they don't get blank settings and cause some performance issues in your environment. So as you can see here, this is a listing of different settings that come over with the server migration tool. And you can see smart protection sources. If you have a lot of smart protection sources, very important. Almost all of these. The most important note is this OfficeScan client port. So when you do the server migration, it will necessarily change that client port. So you do this upon initial setup before you've migrated agents, and you've taken that into the consideration of the update. So it's a fairly simple procedure. Just log into your Apex One console. You'll go to Administration, Settings, and then Server Migration. Brings you to this page, and there's a link to download the Apex One Settings Export tool. And we need to move this to our OfficeScan server to run and grab the settings for importing into our Apex One. So I'm going to copy this file. We'll just show that in folder. It's a fairly small file, as you see here. So we'll just copy this directly onto our OfficeScan XG server. And I'm just taking a lazy roundabout here. You can copy this over however you like. However, I tend to use that admin share. So once you have it copied over, you can go on to your OfficeScan XG server, and we'll continue the migration here. So I copied it to the root, simply extract it, wherever you want to extract it. And then we run the tool as administrator. Very important. Only takes a few seconds, and as you see, we have the 3 that come out of it, the 3 policies from the OfficeScan server, which is related to DLP, the actual agent policies themselves, which we can use to import in Apex Central, and then the server settings migration, which is what we're really after right now. So I'm going to copy all of these over because we'll use them eventually on later videos. And there we go. Now we're ready to import the settings. So from the same page we were on the Apex One, we simply click the Import Settings button. Takes us here, and we just browse to where we copied them over. I'm on a different server than my Apex one, so I had to actually go to the admin share to get these. All right, it's asking if I want to import the Apex 1 server settings and overwrite all current Apex 1 server settings. Very important to know that in our KB it tells you what's going to move, and if you are not comfortable with moving those, then you'll have to, recreate the settings yourself. So right now it's a fresh setup, and I do want it to mimic my Office Scan XG just for the ease of agent migration. And there we go. Server settings imported successfully. So now we'll be able to go to the agent management screen and we'll see the domains that weren't there before. And there they are. These are all the domains from my existing Office Scan server. And as you can see, there's no agents over here yet. However, the different levels of settings I have set are all going to be here. I don't know if I particularly have any since I've been using Control Manager to issue policy to my agents. And that's it for the agent migration, or not the agent migration, that's it for the server migration.
All right. So that was fun. I hit the button and it played the video. Wasn't ready for it, but there you guys go. So we do have a question here I just wanted to address real quick, and it seems to be a common question. The question is, in which situation do we need to use SQL Standard versus Enterprise Edition? This is pretty much your organization's decision. There's no specification that you need to use either Enterprise or Standard. If you want Endpoint Sensor, then you just need Standard or Enterprise 2016 SP1 or later. We don't really make any distinctions. So depending on what your organization's needs are, it would dictate that kind of decision. All right, and back to it. Apex 1 agent migration path. Another one of my favorites. So we have different methods of agent migration. I get asked this question a lot. So we have, I'd guess 5. There's probably a couple more in this, but the 5 major ones are the web console move, using the MSI Install Package, the IPXfer, agent connection settings, and if you've ever talked to me, my favorite, the cut, the hammer. All right, for the web console move feature, the pros, you can easily move lots of agents. It's really dependent upon the processing, but I mean, I've helped someone move, 3,000, 4,000 at a time just by selecting them all and selecting move. Took a while for it to process, but it was fairly quick and went right over. Don't need any third-party utilities, and it's just a command that goes out to the agent, so there's no high bandwidth going across the network. Cons, can't move offline agents, independent agents, and you can't really schedule it. So anything, you just have to sit there and watch the console until they all checked in and then move it over. So the MSI install, everyone knows the pros of that. You can use SCCM, GPO, PDQ, name a thing to deploy it, and that's it. So you just install right over it. If the upgrade happens to fail for whatever reason on the endpoint, it'll roll back to its previous version, leaving the endpoint protected, so you don't have to worry about there being no agent on the machine in the event of failure. It's only subject to the parameters of MSI exec, and you can make this pretty verbose. Do a /LV on the MSI, logging verbose, get that log up to your server or your scene, and put it in there for record keeping. The major cons, I guess, are if you're in a security admin position, you have to engage, your other support teams that do the deployment. You'll have to work with them to do it. And I guess the other one, and it's not too bad, there's a KB article here, and it's just editing the OFC scan INI on the server that you're going to be moving to, and then generating the package from there, and it'll allow you to install the MSI over an existing agent to push it there. If you don't do that, it won't move because it's not validated. IPXfer Utility, I'm sure several of you have used it out there. It's just a command prompt utility. It's very easy to script. You could just put it inside of a network share or in any type of deployment that utilizes, batch scripts or PowerShell scripts or what has you. But yeah, it's a very lightweight thing. The con is now it's required to put the unload password in, and that's been true since, I believe, version 11. So you're going to necessarily have the password in a non-obfuscated format initially. If you want to obfuscate it yourself, maybe through a secure string, then you still need to decrypt that as you run it on the machine because it's a command prompt run. So you need to be able to shift that over. Maybe clear text passwords aren't your thing. So large-scale deployment is done through our toolbox or through a third-party utility. I don't know if that's a con per se, but we had to come up with something to put in there, right? And then there's no error to verify if the agent has moved successfully. So either it moves or it doesn't. You just have to look at the console and just verify if it's on one or the other. The agent connection settings, this is inherent to the console. You could just change that, and anything that checks in and gets this new OFC scan INI will move over. And this is easy for cleanup, hard to initially manage. So unless you have everything set specifically correct for the agent to move, if it moves, and let's just say 3,000 check in at the same time and they all decide to move over, they're going to get their new settings from the other server as they move over. And if you have it set to all components update, then you have 3,000 agents updating off of the server all simultaneously. And this can cause a huge amount of bandwidth impact in your environment. Not only that, but if you're not ready to test new functionality, then you've just set yourself up for a very fun evening. The cut tool, the best, some would say, that's ever existed. The pros are it's a very clean install with no previous agent settings. Once you run it, it pretty much tears out all registry keys, all folders, all files, everything from the old agent. And when you package it with the MSI and you deploy it, it'll do that, plus install your new package. So you're installing fresh on a new machine. The cons are it is that two-step process, uninstallation, installation. So for that period of time between the install and uninstall, you're going to have a vulnerable agent. Whether that's an acceptable risk in your environment is completely up to you. I found that it usually takes about 3 to 5 minutes to run the cut, and then an extra, 2 minutes or whatever to run the install. So somewhere in between that period, you are vulnerable for that short period of time. If the MSI fails to install after running the cut, then there's nothing to roll back to. There's no more agent. So essentially, it's just going to be agentless until you can redeploy the MSI to it. So that's a major con of it. And then the slight con, very slight con, is it expires quarterly for security reasons, obviously. So you have to obtain cut from support, and it has to be through someone entitled to support through our structure. General deployment strategy, I'm sure we all know this and have been through this several times over, but it's worth reiterating. Always use pilot groups, always, especially when you're feature testing new products that you haven't had in your environment before. You have to validate whether it's going to work in your environment, what's going to trigger on it, whether you have the settings set correctly. It's a bunch of stuff. So this leads to a phased deployment. Once you have your pilot group set up, you're checking it out. You have your pilot groups, varied, so you represent, your dev, your HR, your administrative team or whatever, so you can see how different people are reacting to the different new products. Then you have to take a methodical approach. You do that to reduce the risk of impact to your environment. After you validate the pilot group and everything, you just start deploying to a larger test group. And once you have that large test group, you could see what the reactivity is. And based upon that is when you do your large scale. Now, a lot of new product deployments obviously should go off-peak hours. And this would be based upon your pilot group, of course. Check the impact. Is it high enough to, say, schedule out a period from midnight to 6 a.m.? Like what period of time do you want to do? But it should definitely be off-peak hours because you're going to have traffic flowing through, and then you're going to have potential impacts like application control, lockdown, inventory scans, and you don't want to saddle your users with that. Again, the deployments are done through Apex Central Policy Management for the new integrated products. So try to get used to having your agents managed by policy rather than directly off the Apex One server itself. Oh, bah! We've reached the end of the webcast. So here we are. Did it in a record time, 40 minutes flat. So we're going to go ahead and start the Q&A session right now. So feel free to answer any questions. And as they come up, I'll go ahead and try to answer some of them. And anything we don't get to, we'll definitely write down what you have and then email you back with any answers. So thank you very much for joining today's webinar. I appreciate it. And thank you. All right, our first Q&A. We have a question here. Does Apex One support high availability / failover? Microsoft clustering, yes, we do. So if you're utilizing Microsoft clustering, then most definitely so. XG is going to be continued. The question is Office Scan. Will it still be supported, and how long can it remain on before you migrate? So XG support will continue until 2021 right now. However, if you're going to start your migration, you have a couple of years before you really have to start worrying about it. Office Scan 11 though, that's something you're going to want to look into pretty much in the next month or two, because that ends at the end of the year, I believe, or January of next year. Can you query the API to know which clients have checked in? Not so much what clients have checked in. I'll have to look into that data a little bit further. However, you can get a list of agents directly off of the server and a bunch of statistics regarding them. So I'll look into how much specificity we can get out regarding those agents. I can't recall directly right now if the date fields come out of it. Next question is, are you able to pull over policies from the Control Manager server? Yeah, absolutely. You could definitely export the policies from Control Manager and import them into Apex Central. But to use the additional integrated features, a policy from Control Manager will not work. Well, obviously can't carry over what it doesn't have, right? So once you migrate them over, you'll just have to set up the new integrated features and then deploy them to the agents that you want to target. And on the targeting topic, I guess, I would highly recommend filtering. That way any new agents that appear in domains, whether it be set up for Active Directory or the Apex One domain structure, you'll want them to get that policy as soon as possible, and filtering will allow that to occur naturally without you having to put them in there and then retarget the policy. All right, next question is there an article outlining Office Scan versus Apex One? So yeah, I've heard this question quite a bit. So people are wondering why they should move from Office Scan to Apex One. It's the same reason you would move from Office Scan XG to Office Scan XG SP1. This is the next iteration. It has more features, and specifically in Apex One, the one bright point out of my mind besides the integrated agent is fileless malware. If you want to start blocking a lot of fileless malware, this is Apex One in a nutshell. It's a huge thing, and it's becoming more prevalent every day. So yeah, definitely start moving up. Oh, there's a lot of questions today. Look at this. You guys are great. Next question. Apex One play well with Cisco AnyConnect? Yeah, yes, there's just a couple edits you need to make to your, I believe, OFC scan INI off the top of my head. Once you make that change, it'll allow you to use VPN. It's basically VPNs interacting with the NDIS filters and different things like that. So once you make the edit, it should work. And if you're having a problem right now with Cisco AnyConnect, if you look up a KB article for, I believe what I usually search is Office Scan XG Cisco AnyConnect, it'll have the instructions on there. But if you have any problems whatsoever, then just give us a call here at support. Yes, there is sorry, I'm reading and answering questions at this point. All right, the question is there a minimum patch level if migrating from Office Scan 11 or XG to a new Apex One server? Yes. Office Scan 11 does have a minimum level. I don't have the exact build off the top of my head, but I think it's SP3, if I'm not mistaken, for Office Scan 11. And that's SP3 and up. So XG SP1, I don't believe there is a minimum version you need to be on, but we'll definitely answer that more directly and get that answer to you as soon as possible. All right, the question is, we haven't looked at Apex Central yet, but is this a rebrand of Control Manager? Can we upgrade Control Manager in place or install Apex Central on a new server? Short answer is yes. So pretty much yes to all of it. Yeah, it's a rebrand of Control Manager. It's almost identical in functionality, except it has additional menus, features, policies, different things like that. You can go in place, and in most circumstances for Apex Central, I would recommend going in place. Apex One is the one I would recommend migrating to a new server. And the reasons are various, but the Control Manager itself, it does update the DB schema, but a lot of the logs you want to retain. You don't necessarily want to migrate them to a new place depending on your situation. So doing an upgrade in place there is great. Just make sure to do the disaster recovery, such as backing up the database and taking a snapshot, because if something does happen, like your SQL Server goes down in the middle of a DB schema update, you're going to have some major issues, and you just want to be able to back it up and have your snapshot in place so you can just revert exactly to where you were before you started it. Question is, could you please state again which OS versions do not support the Apex One agent? I have a document on this, but from the top of my head, and I'm just going to answer this from the top of my head, Windows 7 and up, minus Windows 8, I believe, is supported. Windows XP not supported, 2008 non-R2 and below are not supported. So 2008 R2 and up for servers, and then Windows 7, Windows 10 for workstation OSs. This question is, Apex One only available as a service? I'm not seeing the on-premise licensing in our portal. Also, how do I get more information on what endpoint sensor is, and is it optional? So Apex One is on-premise, yes, and it's also available as a service as well. Depending on your licensing would determine if you're licensed for it. If you had, Office Scan XG license, then you definitely have an Apex One license. You might not necessarily have an Apex One as a service license. If you have the Smart Protection Complete package, it changes things a little bit. Overall, if you contact your sales, they can really detail that out. As for information on what endpoint sensor is, it is an event recording system, essentially, and it records malicious events or suspected malicious events and uses the attack discovery engine to find persistent threats. It then uploads that information to the Apex One server and metadata to the Apex Central server. That metadata is used to create investigations, so you could trail out exactly what happened during a period of indicator of attack or indicator of compromise. So you could trail it back to potential malware or an originating part of malware, such as an obfuscated PowerShell that went off through, an API call to something else, and it leads here to there and then downloads a malware. So you'd want to find that whole path, and that's what Endpoint Sensor allows you to do. And yes, it is optional. Endpoint Sensor is 100% a separate license, and you don't necessarily need it unless you want a EDR functionality or MDR functionality. And since we're on that topic, I might as well talk about that as well. Someone asked earlier, what's the difference between EDR and MDR? So that's endpoint detection and response versus managed detection and response. So endpoint detection and response is just the ability to do the investigations through, let's say, Apex Central. So an administrator or your team can go through, start investigations, and do all that. But if you have a relatively small group of people working, maybe you don't have time to do all these investigations because, let's face it, people who develop malware are particularly clever sometimes, and it's difficult to find exactly how they're compromising your system. Maybe you don't want to spend 10 hours looking for the trail that leads back to what initiated this malware. And that's where MDR comes in. You talk to us, we get you hooked up, and our team here, malware experts, help you and assist you with these investigations. And, depending on the permission you give us, we'll take action or request permission to take action and provide you reports of what's going on. So it's a great feature for anyone who doesn't have the resources to do all the EDR investigations, but want that state of mind that they're safe and knowing what happened during a period of time. Question is, if I don't integrate Apex Central, can I get application control and vulnerability protection of functionality in Apex One right now? Negative. You need to have Apex Central because you cannot deploy the integrated products through Apex One. It is only through Apex Central policy. So you absolutely need to integrate the two if you want to deploy application control or vulnerability protection. All right, I think that's about it for the day. Hopefully you guys enjoyed all the stuff, and we'll definitely get around to your questions. We're not cherry picking here. I'm just going down the list as they come in. So there's a lot of questions coming in, and we'll definitely answer them all and email you the answers either directly or, hey, maybe might make a KB or another video based upon your questions. I like them. So let me just give you a quick shout out before we end this thing. There's now like 25, I think, live support, or not live, but support videos we've created going over a lot of the topics we talked today, sometimes a little more in depth. You can check those out on YouTube, and it's just me talking like this, essentially. So if you enjoyed today's webinar, you might enjoy those, and give them a shout. And if you need us, just give us a call here at support, and we'll be happy to help you out. All right, guys. Thanks, and have a good one. Bye.